The other day, the Chicago Bulls took on the Charlotte Hornets in what otherwise was an uneventful matchup. Two expected lottery teams, one of the Ball brothers being injured, teams that have uncertain futures and directions. A game most NBA fans likely didn't watch unless you're a diehard Bulls fan like myself or an avid watcher of the Charlotte Hornets. But in that game, something happened that drew millions of fans' attention to get them to speak up and tear into the league for why the NBA's product isn't what it used to be. In that game, the Hornets and the Bulls combined for 75 missed three-pointers, the most in NBA history. Not 75 threes taken in a game, but missed threes alone. A total of 97 threes were attempted in that basketball game, while only 22 of them were made. When this stat was shared on social media, there was a public outcry from folks around the world citing this is what is wrong with the NBA and why the league continues to decline in ratings and popularity. Teams jacking up threes without any semblance of stylistic offensive player creativity. Gone are the days of team identities, fierce competition, defensive tenacity. Just spread the floor, hoist up threes, and try to win the game in a shootout. That's the perception of the NBA today by most fans. But while the NBA as a league does struggle with some real challenges, they continue to see a decline in ratings year over year, the real problem with the decline in basketball fandom and why people have stopped watching the NBA is actually much more nuanced than teams just throwing up a bunch of threes and hoping to be like the 2015 Warriors. A problem most NBA fans probably don't even realize it. So let's talk about it. Be sure to subscribe if you like this type of content to help the channel grow, and in return I'll be providing more NBA content like this. As a kid growing up in the 90s and falling in love with the game of basketball, watching the 90s dynasty of the Chicago Bulls, I will never forget my early days watching the games with my dad. No distractions, no smartphones, no social media, just the big tube-like TV and Michael Jordan shredding teams up with his greatness on a nightly basis. Those were the days. The game was physical, it was competitive, and it was entertaining. I looked forward to every game that I could watch, and it became my favorite childhood pastime. Since the 90s, though, the game has changed a lot. The way offenses are run are night and day compared to what you see from 30 years ago. Much more floor spacing, the mid-range game has been wiped out, defenses aren't what they used to be with the hand-checking rules in place, foul baiting wasn't a thing of the past because you would get rocked for it if you tried. Even the officiating of the game has completely changed, with fouls being called over the smallest touches, whereas in the past they simply would let the guys play on. And when we watch today's NBA and remember what it was in the past, we tend to reminisce and get nostalgic of the old playing days and start complaining about the current product. But what if I told you that it's actually human nature to miss something of the past that no longer exists? A longing for those past experiences that we once shared, enjoyable memories that we want to bring back to present day. That can literally apply to anything, not just our fondest memories of the NBA. We are wired as humans to remember past memories that bring us happiness, and we compare those memories, events, or experiences to what is happening today. We oftentimes become jaded or disassociate with the current state, and thus we criticize and complain, wishing things had never changed. But while there are certain aspects of the league that are a problem and absolutely need to be addressed to improve the overall product on the floor, which I'll get into, the narrative and discourse around the NBA today is mostly just nostalgic, unsupported based claim and opinions, and a lot of whining with no regard for facts, data, or research whatsoever. Because as much as I love the game of the past, and I greatly miss the physicality, the fierceness of the competition, watching old highlights and film of the 90s and 2000s, it's pretty clear that the product was much inferior than what it is today. Talent level around the league, the efficiency on offense, the up and down pace of play pales in comparison to what we saw in the 90s. Starting level players in the NBA from 20 or 30 years ago wouldn't even find a spot in the rotation today. Players have simply gotten more skilled, perfected their craft, and they figured out how to shoot the three ball at a high enough rate to impact the game. As fun as basketball was in the 90s and even in the 2000s, teams were averaging a little over 93 points per game in the 90s and even slightly less than that in the early 2000s, and the league average shooting percentage back then was anywhere between 41 and 44% from the field. And yes, that is on far less shots from three than what we see today, which would obviously bring overall averages down considering it's more of a difficult shot to make. However, the league average right now in the NBA is sitting at 47% shooting from the field and 37% from three, with an average true shooting percentage of 57% compared to the horrendous true shooting percentage of 53% back in the 90s. For context, even the most efficient teams in the late 90s, being the Bulls and the Utah Jazz, would be below average on offense in terms of their overall shooting compared to today. And over 20 teams in the league from the 97-98 season were less efficient on offense than the worst offensive team in the NBA this season, that being the Washington Wizards. So the next logical argument is, well, the reason offenses weren't as great back in the day was because the defense in the league was significantly better than what you see now, which again reinforces this idea that the competition was more fierce than what it is today, while today's generation barely puts forth effort on that end of the floor. And while yes, that is true, the level of defense today isn't what it once was, as today's league average in defensive rating sits at 113.2, the average defensive rating across the entire decade of the 90s sits at a little over 106, meaning teams like the Thunder, Rockets, and Orlando Magic would actually all be above average defensive teams even by 90s defensive numbers, despite the much improved and efficient offensive output we see today with less turnovers and higher percentage shots being taken. So while defense clearly wasn't what it used to be, it isn't non-existent as a lot of fans like to claim. It's more so that offenses have just become so good that it makes defense in the NBA look terrible. There are also a lot of other somewhat baseless narratives primarily coming from the media that the players simply put don't care about the game anymore, they care about their money, their fame, the celebrity status, and that's about it. While I won't disagree that that's the case for some, there are a lot of players who give it their all when they're on the court and make the game that much more exciting. That said, there are a lot of problems with the state of the NBA today that we do need to address and discuss. Things like load management, stars skipping out on games whenever they feel like it, players being too soft, foul baiting, and of course, the lack of diversity and creativity in the style of play. Seeing a game where teams jack up nearly 100 threes and miss 75% of them is not fun to watch. And unless you're an absolute sicko diehard fan, yeah, you're probably going to tune into something else for your nightly entertainment. The NBA also needs to stop doing these gimmicky attempts to make the season more exciting, like the NBA Cup, changing the format of the All-Star Game 17 different times to where the players themselves don't even know what the hell is going on. And also, stop changing so many aspects of the rules from season to season where the fans can't even follow along with what's going on anymore. While some people like change, most people don't. They like what's familiar. They like what reminds them of the past. And they like keeping things simple. Nostalgia and the NBA changing so rapidly, even from what the product was just 10 years ago, has enabled the fans to withdraw and stop watching. That said, while the ratings are down, sentiment around the state of the NBA is more negative than ever before. We also have to remember that a lot of these narratives are social media created. Take the Bulls-Hornets game that I mentioned at the top of the video, 75 combined missed threes, in a game that most fans probably didn't even watch. But once that stat gets shared on social media, suddenly you have millions of fans, most of which didn't even watch the game, talking about it and why this is everything that's wrong with the NBA today. The quote-unquote what's wrong with the NBA discourse is primarily driven by way of social media, to the point where it becomes so negative and toxic that you start to believe it even if you do still in fact love watching the games. When in reality, the product, the on the court, the drama, the competition is still pretty damn good. It could be better, no question, but this narrative that the NBA is dying or boring to watch is downright wrong. The NBA, the game of basketball, is still incredibly fun to watch, but we've become a society that is, one, nostalgic to its core and missing the old days, but also a society where our attention spans have gotten smaller and smaller. TikTok culture, Insta stories, YouTube shorts, swiping from one video to the next, everyone wants everything bite-sized, instant gratification. Sitting for a full 2.5-hour game multiple times a week, simply put, isn't what people do nowadays. Myself included, I find it hard from time to time to watch an entire game without all the distractions surrounding me. Those are the bigger problems not being talked about enough for the NBA's perceived decline. Nostalgia, shorter attention spans, and quite frankly, false or inaccurate narratives being created on social media that aren't based on facts or data that have further perpetuated this negative perception around the NBA. I would love to hear what you guys think though. Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.